One. Welcome to episode 94 of the Hoop Threads podcast here with a good friend, Marshall Cho, former coach at Lake Oswego, as well as DeMatha, some other stops internationally. Coach Cho, how you feeling?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yes.
Episode 94?
Yes, sir.
So that was a good year for me. That was my junior year, 94, 95, actually going into my senior year. I listened to your episode 22 with Coach Jones, and he was giving you a hard time about being number 22. So I don't know where 94 fits in, but thanks for having me.
My fault. All right. So kind of take me
I'm
back
coming out swinging. Yeah.
there you go. Let's take it back to the beginning, talk about your early start in the game as a player and kind of what made you fall in love with the game, and then kind of we'll get through your journey after that.
Yeah, Aaron, thanks for having me. I was telling you before getting on that, I've done a handful of podcasts and sometimes I get tired of my own voice and even recalling these journeys, but hopefully there's some new listeners that will, pull something out of it. But, I oftentimes I tell people that, one of my main points of identity is being an immigrant. I was born and raised in South Korea. I came to the States when I was 10. South Korea being predominantly a soccer and baseball country, and immigrating to Springfield, Oregon, of all places, not speaking the language, but we happen to live across the street from a park. And so this is to date myself, but it's 1986. Kids still played on the blacktop. So just not having a lot of resources, being one of those situations where we grew up on free and reduced lunch. Basketball was a sport that I had access to because our family could afford it. Because all that my mom and dad had to do was buy me a ball, and now I'm out in the playground and making friends and learning the game on my own without trainers, without AAU teams, and all of that as well. So that's where I started. Fell in love with the game. Got to play my first organized game as a seventh grader. So that's a lot of time. That's, if you really think about it, that's 4 years on your own, practicing, self-learning, push motivating and all that. And then really got to have my first coaching experience, receiving coaching as a seventh grader in middle school.
Mm-hmm. Got you. Kind of after that, went to the University of Oregon, then did graduate school at Columbia University. And then after that, I believe you started working with Teach for America in some underprivileged neighborhoods in Harlem and South Bronx. Talk about how, that experience as a teacher, and also, I believe it was a middle school basketball coach, kind of, gave you some building blocks to kind of work off of, and what you kind of learned through that process.
Yeah, it's ironic that as I'm telling this story that I'm sharing about my very first experience as in an organized team structure was as a seventh grader at our middle school, public school middle school team, where we had I think it was 8-game season, but it was significant enough that it still to this day I remember those coaches from my seventh and eighth grade years as being very formative. So, fast forward, I graduated from University of Oregon in 2000. I then joined the Teach for America program. And next thing I know, I'm in the South Bronx, on my first teaching assignment, teaching seventh grade math. And, I end up just kind of as a new teacher, just checking out the scene in the recess, during lunchtime and find, kids out there, on the blacktops of the South Bronx on 138th and Morris Avenue, in the heart of the South Bronx neighborhood. And I ended up just playing pickup basketball with the kids, during breaks. And so that was a reminder that all those, that the big chunk of time in between that, what the game had given me, I was able to use it back to connect with the kids in a completely different neighborhood, in a completely different, ethnic, setting, socioeconomic setting. Yet, it was a chance to connect on a level that took me back to my own childhood. And it also, I think in many ways, it gave me some street cred with my players or with my, students first. And it gave me a chance to, survive those first 2-3 years when oftentimes as a first year, second year teacher, it can be very, very challenging in schools such as the one I was placed in.
Mm-hmm. Your next experience was kind of, working with running some different basketball camps in Mozambique. Talk about, what led to that opportunity, and then kind of the opportunity, to work in the States, that you bumped into Coach Jones out there.
Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate how this is kind of rolling fast. There's a lot of years in between, but really,
Mhm.
fast forwarding is, I taught in the South Bronx for 3 years, and then after that, I taught at a public charter school in heart of Harlem for 3 years,
Mhm.
Future Leaders Institute. So in there, that's when I really got my middle school coaching experience, coaching a middle school team of sixth through eighth graders, very talented players. We ended up winning the charter school, New York City charter school, championship. So that was one of those, Disney after school movie moments that, kind of burns in my memory. And to this day, I'm chasing that next championship, whatever that may look like as a head coach. But yeah, I met my wife, during my last year, prior to my last year teaching, in Harlem in the 2005-06 academic year. We got married in 06, and I moved out to Mozambique. And really, that first year was a chance to learn the language, learn the people, and adapt. So it was a period of adjustment. I over that the next 3 years that I lived in Mozambique, I had a chance to do just a wide ranging area of basketball, whether it was just working with kids who had never played basketball before in a rural area of Mozambique, to working with the junior national team players, working with some, professional players who were playing in the professional league there. So really those 3 years was formative in the sense that, and I think it's a theme that continues to this day, that it was showing me that I needed to work on having a wide range if I'm going to have a national level impact, small country. And so I did that for 3 years. And at the end of my third year, as my wife and I were about to transition back to the States, I had hosted Coach Jones of DeMatha Catholic and Tony Dorado of Nike Elite High School Basketball, on a clinic. So essentially, I think we were flying back home like mid-June, like first week of June. And I had set up a bunch of clinics, and then work with some junior national team players, and had Coach Jones come out and really share the game and teach the game. And at the end of the full week, he and I took Tony and Mike and myself to a safari in South Africa, and showed him parts of that part of the world that only a very few people get to experience. So it's a trip that we still talk about to this day. We talk about going on a safari trip in South Africa, and seeing a lion just out the window, and hearing the roar, and like I can't remember which is which, but either Tony jumping out of his seat onto my side, or me other way around. But just getting to see that part, we had an immediate bond. And to this day I'll never forget it. The second night Coach was there, he it was one of those quiet moments in the evening after we had a full day of clinics working with kids. And Coach Jones said if I ever ended up back on the stateside and was close enough to DC, that he would love to have me on his coaching staff. So kind of went from there. We ended up relocating to Baltimore of all places, and the next 3 years was commuting from DeMatha to Baltimore and back and forth.
Okay. So, starting with the math of there, what did you learn about delegating and empowering your assistant coaches from Coach Jones that you took with you into your head coach and further coaching opportunities down the road?
Yeah, for people who may not be familiar, I mean, as you've experienced yourself, having been on that staff, nationally recognized program, historic program, a program where very, I mean, Coach Jones was carrying on Coach Wooden's legacy, and very few people get to join that staff, right? And for the most part, like the time that I was there, for myself, there was this conditioning coach who's well known, Alan Stein, had joined my second year. He and I overlapped, and for the stretch that we were there, we were the only non-DeMatha graduates to be on that staff, right? So, you come in. I was starting late in the coaching career in my early 30s, and I think I've done some things in Mozambique, but now I have to come in and humble myself. And my first year, I'm an assistant freshman coach. My second year, I get promoted to being the head freshman coach, and then by my third year, I was the head JV coach. But really, what I learned during that time was just being a part of a team. That the education piece was we all had a role, just like Coach Jones was demanding and expecting out of all the players, right? My first year on staff, Victor Oladipo was a senior, Jerry Grant was a senior, Quinn Cook was a junior, winning the WCAC Player of the Year. And you think about a team like that where Justin Black goes on to be a Division I player locally, and he's somebody who's coming off the bench, right? There's Jeremy Grant as a sophomore who's not getting that much playing time, but we all know he, out of all the guys, may have the longest career in the NBA. So it just watching the level of talent and watching those players embrace their role. It was the same thing. I was one of 11 assistant coaches. So it was all about just coming in and asking Coach Jones what he needed the most and being willing to do the dirty work. I ended up filming all the varsity games as if I was a student manager. So now I'm 33 years old, sitting next to an 18-year-old from Gonzaga or St. John's and doing that work. But Coach Jones trusts me with it, for that year. He needed somebody to do it. He didn't have a student manager who could do it. So I did that work. I took photos, I took stats, I took, anything that would require, for me to play my role in having, success for the team. I was embracing it. At the same time, I was one of two assistant coaches on the freshman team, right? So I learned how to be an assistant coach for a head coach on a direct, manner on the freshman team. And then, my second and third year, like it's rare for a JV coach or a freshman coach to also have two assistant coaches. So, but it was on one hand being a part of an assistant coaching staff, but also like being a head coach and treating it like I wanted to be that head coach one day, right? So it was a great opportunity to just immediately put into practice and implement what I was, witnessing Coach Jones do with his own varsity staff. So by the time I got, fast forward and, 3 years later, I'm the head coach at Lake Oswego High School. I kind of had a idea of what I wanted, out of my assistant coaches. I think it's loyalty, number one. It's willingness to do the dirty work. And then it's, constantly like committing to working on your craft so that you're improving just as much as, you're expecting your players to do the same.
Mm-hmm. Got you. What have you learned too about kind of picking and choosing your spots as an assistant and kind of how that transferred to, taking their advice and stuff during games and filtering out, what suggestions of theirs you kind of want to move forward with as a head coach versus, sometimes no, like let's save that for down the line. Talk about what insights you kind of gain there.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of it just comes, the amount of voice that you're able to contribute comes with the amount of trust that you earn from the coaches. For me, I would say, there's the caddy's creed, I think, in golf, right? Like show up, keep up, like shut up, show up, shut up, keep up, right? What does that mean? Like shut up seems like such a strong statement to say, but it's really you want to show up first, right? And you want to keep up. And I think if you can prove those two things, then at some point you can go ahead to move forward from shutting up to sharing your voice, right? I think from the varsity level team, I mean, we're talking about Coach Jones' staff with Reggie Vini, Tommy Palucci, and all these guys who've been with them from the beginning. So I think it's in an instance like that, you wait, and really pick that quiet moment when Coach Jones may be more receptive to thinking about something that you may offer an observation, if you will, right? But at the same time, like when I saw how open he was to receiving feedback or challenging of ideas from his veteran staff, the ones who've been with them for that long period of time, I really got to see that, okay, like it the role of that head coach is to get a wide ranging viewpoints, and then being able to decipher like what path makes the most sense for the team. So again, having seen that firsthand, I think the 8 years that I had, I think my first few years, I think just because we're getting started, I did tend to just kind of lean more on myself. But moving forward to like years 3, 4, 5, where we had won 3 straight league titles, I think that's when really, even as a coaching staff, we were hitting our peak. That I had improved as a coach and accepting, right, and ideas that may even challenge something that I may have held on to for a long time, or may have been a blind spot for me as a head coach.
Mm.
Um, I was really able to lean on assistant coaches who had for 2, 3 years, they've shown that they were going to be committed to what we are trying to build together. I think that's something that can be frustrating for a lot of young assistant coaches. They feel like their voice isn't being heard, but I think it's something that's overlooked often these days. Like coaches want to come and have their, say right away, without having shown up or kept up, or, shown that, they're going to work on preparing just as much as a head coach has done.
Mhm.
Right. So yeah, I think that one of the things that I know it was challenging for me, um, I've never seen a head coach watch as much film as Coach Jones. So like, how would you, you know what I'm saying? Like, how are you going to bring something up like if you haven't watched this as much, right? And so that's the other piece is like, what what are you willing to do in the off hours that shows the head coach that you kept up in terms of that level of preparation, so that if you do say something, you're on similar planes of preparation,
Mhm.
that the head coach would actually respect what you have to offer up.
Yeah, I think that's something big that I took away from working with Coach Jones too, because he would watch every game film 2 or 3 times, even before he watched film with the
Right.
players, the next day. And I think, he kind of pointed out some of the subtleties and the intricacies of the game that he may have missed because, he was so zoomed in on a particular part of a play. He may have missed, a good help side rotation or something from Marshall Cho on one possession, then the next possession he messed it up, and he really got on Marshall, but he hadn't seen the positive stuff he had done down the line because he was so
Right.
zoomed in on one aspect of it, or talking to an assistant coach about strategy or timeout. So definitely something that
Yeah.
I value as well. So you worked with Coach Jones with the Hoop Summit with we were talking earlier about James Robinson got the invite his senior year,
Mhm.
and you got to that was kind of your beginnings, kind of working with Team USA in different capacities. Give me a good story, or talk about what you learned being around Coach Jones and Coach Showalter, and some of the other coaches that they have on staff, working with the best of the best that America has to offer.
Yeah. I mean, I get that question a lot. How'd you get involved with USA basketball? And I think it's, what it's a tough one just because everyone's journey into an organization is unique. And I happen to have been involved with them early on when people could volunteer. But it's, a couple, I wouldn't say it's a funny story of any type, but, I did get a chance to, have my first foot in the door in the 2012 Hoop Summit game. And this is when Kevin Boyle was the head coach. Coach Jones was the assistant. James Robinson, who was a 4-year starter at Pitt, now currently an assistant coach and making his way at Delaware, was one of the last minute, players to be invited. Um, it's funny. I was looking back at that roster the other day. You're talking about, guys like Gary Harris, Archie Goodwin, right? Shabazz Muhammad. It was interesting. Just it's one thing to be at DeMatha and see the loaded roster, but then you take it another step where everybody's an All-American, and it was an eye-opening experience for sure. But I think the biggest thing I take away from all my years of USA basketball is um, how those doors open up when somebody's speaking good about you behind your back. I'm sure you've heard of that quote before. Be mindful of who's rooting for you behind closed doors, right? So,
Hmm.
so I remember I had a chance to meet B.J. Johnson, who was the first ever junior national team director, as along with Coach Showalter, who was the first, junior national team head coach. And we had a chance to meet at Snow Valley, Iowa, a camp that Coach Showalter runs annually, with 400 plus kids from the Midwest, coming in onto Wartburg, a D3 campus, and getting their basketball Jones on. And the first time I met BJ, he had said he had heard a lot about me, and that was a shock because I had only been on Coach Jones' staff for a year at that point. And that was one of those moments like I have a boss who's, I had done my job keeping up. I think that's the theme of the day, but that he was speaking highly on my behalf, so that my first impression that I get to leave with this, junior national team director is something positive. And he offered up, hey, anytime you want to come observe, um, volunteer, you're welcome to. Right. So that's that first invitation.
Mhm.
And I think for young people, maybe young players listening to this or young coaches, oftentimes like you just kind of take that and you don't take the next step. But I think what I've done throughout the course of my career is if I see that kind of an opening, then I'm going to, be decisive and follow up. So that's exactly what I ended up doing. I had just finished up my third year at DeMatha. I was kind of at a crossroads because, as you know, the assistant coaches on Coach Jones' staff, they're lifers, right? So there's I kind of hit a cap in terms of my growth potential. I would have been happy to come back maybe as a JV coach another year or whatnot. But it was really okay. If I'm looking for a collegiate experience at that point, do I go to the Final Four and be one of a million faces passing out resumes and cover letters and shaking hands versus being that one person in a exclusive setting like the Hoop Summit, being one of the only volunteer at that time as a support staff member, so that I go out there and next thing you know, Coach Boyle, like the first night of practice, they had one of the players hadn't flown in yet, so there's 9 guys, and so Coach Boyle is throwing me out there as the 10th guy on the scrimmage floor, 5-on-5 with these All Americans, right? And Mitch McGarry's like, I don't know if you guys remember Mitch McGarry, but
Yep.
he's a character. But like in the middle of like the 5 up and down, he's like, "Hey, how are you? How was your day?" And I'm just trying to keep up, and not hurt myself or not embarrass myself. So, but I think all of it I think it comes back down to the theme of show up and keep up.
Okay.
And then it led to this 10-year run of volunteering with USA Basketball that culminated in, for me having an opportunity to be a court coach and things of that nature.
Hmm. Okay. You've been around, I think it was 4 different NBA players, at DeMatha, in addition to multiple NBA guys with your Team USA, kind of experience. What habits or mindsets kind of set them apart from the average basketball player? And then kind of a two-part question. The second part of that is, what kind of is I guess the 1 degree of separation that leads to success from that elite class of, Hoop Summit or All American that leads to the successful NBA career down the road? Kind of what's that 1% difference that you've noticed in your experience?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm smart enough to give you a percentage breakdown, whether it's 1% or 5% or whatnot. The 4 players you're mentioning, are Victor Oladipo, Jaren Grant, Quinn Cook, and Jeremy Grant, correct?
Mhm.
So, I think about, you know, really think about guys like Victor and Jaren, who I only got to see for a year, but those are guys who would show up to Breakfast Club like every morning. And I think for those 2 guys, I think it's really that chip of being underrated, overlooked. And I mean, you talk about both those guys, they were maybe on the fringe of the top 100 ranking. Victor wasn't on it, maybe Jaren was in the 90s or whatnot. But for both of them, what I got to see just for that 1 year that I overlapped was their incredible work ethic. But then you also see that for both of them, they kind of ran their own race, right? They went to a program that valued them and they weren't one and dones. It's the same thing. I believe they started as, and on the DeMatha program as a freshman players, right? As freshman year, they didn't go JV and varsity right away. So I think for those guys, it's clearly an example of delayed gratification.
Mhm.
I look at somebody like Quinn Cook, and I think just somebody who just ultimately just so confident in his belief in himself that he was going to make it. It was just really something to watch how he became the first in like 20 years or something crazy like that to be the WCAC player as a junior, as an underclassman, which just never happened. But
Mhm.
on a team that was that loaded, like when the game was on the line, he was looking for to make an impact with his shot making. And
Mhm.
so that I think that confidence and belief in yourself is something that, always kind of is a longevity thing that always holds. And then, I think about somebody like Jeremy Grant, it's the same thing. I mean, you talk about somebody who was, back then, like all the NBA scouts were on a team like that, they were drooling over Jeremy, right? Just because you can't teach 6'9" and mobility and, 7+ wingspan. But I think it's the same thing for somebody like Jeremy who ends up being the 39 draft pick, so he wears number 39, his rookie year and on, and, somebody who's steadily like added to his game, right? So I think that piece is, somebody who you learn to embrace a role and then you let that, you knock out that role and then your role expands, right? So by the time when I left and James Robinson and Jeremy Grant are seniors, like he's having to be a leading scorer. He's having to be a guy who takes big shots. And so just to see that evolution, I think it's the chip on your shoulder, it's delayed gratification, and it's some combination of confidence. And I look at somebody like locally, I had a chance to coach Peyton Pritchard. I think he's somebody who, embodies like all those qualities because I got to see him get cut, his junior year at USA Basketball. He got cut because, for the junior national team, we would push and emphasize, the ability to guard full court, right? And at that time, we had guys like Malik Newman and DeBarrel Ramsey, who, both of those guys had great careers, but Peyton was the one who got cut, and he's 10 years later, he's the only one still playing in the NBA, right? So I think that the combination of those three things, they don't reveal themselves right away. I think that's a challenge of a scout, like for yourself, for coaches, who are looking for a player to be a part of their organization. I look at somebody like Peyton, or I look at even, if you really say the fifth NBA player that I got to work with is Markelle Fultz,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I had left by the time he was in sixth, seventh, and eighth grade when I was, coaching at DeMatha. So that meant that the only interaction I ever had with him was at our summer camps. And, even the funny story about that, like I had a chance to see him when I coached against him at the Les Schwab Invitational, and he recognized me right away. But, for this is the part of, Markel's amazing journey is that I don't remember. He was a face in the crowd, so um, that just goes to show you somebody like him as well, like who's gone through this, the highest of the highest of being the number one draft pick and then, everything that he's gone through. But here he is, still, persevering and pushing and making a career of it. So I think those combinations, you just never know, but the character and to stick with it, for guys like Markelle and Peyton, it's the same kind of DNA that I got to see with Victor and Jerry and Quinn and Jeremy.
Yeah, I talk to parents all the time about just patience, and even if they go to a big school or the right school, that might involve them sitting for a year or so. And I just explain, look, like Jared, Victor Oladipo and Markelle Fultz. Victor, I believe, was on JV his first year, and I think he was on
No, so
varsity.
Victor was on. That's
Was
what
he
I
a
was
freshman
saying.
too?
I believe he played on the freshman team for Tilden Brill, who
Yeah.
was, former DeMatha grad and assistant coach. So both those guys played on the freshman team and then made the leap to varsity their sophomore year.
Then we're
So
drafted top three, 3 years later.
yeah,
So, 4 years
yeah,
later. So just goes to show that if you keep putting in the work in, it's eventually going to work out. So,
yeah.
we kind of touched on the Portland experience a little bit. You talk about, taking the Lake Oswego job. What were some of the staples going in that you wanted your program to have, after all of that experience learning under some great coaches for all those years?
Yeah, it's for those who may not know, on the West Coast, this is a storied program in its own. It's a program that won a state championship with Kevin Love, who, his senior year was the national, Naismith National Player of the Year. We've had some really good players come before and after as well. Salim Stoudemire is another one that, many may not know is a Lake Oswego alum. So similar to DeMatha, the not many head coaches had held the position. Prior to me, there was a coach who had held it for 20 years. And prior to that coach, there was a coach who had it for 30 years. So in that sense, I had a chance to shepherd that program for 8 years. So that's three, you can round up and say that's three coaches in 60 years, Maybe it's one of those stats, when you play on the floor with, Michael Jordan, you say, hey, Mike, MJ and I, combined for 50 points tonight when they had, you had two, something of that nature. But, I did get to helm that program for 8 years. And really, I think the biggest thing taking over the program in 2015 is, setting a culture, knowing that there's history already there, but bringing your own, values to it. So for me personally, it was, picking the three words of courage, presence, and trust. I've said this in other podcast interviews as well. I've had one word, exercise where courage was a word that I picked my first year at University of Portland. Really, making that jump to Division I world, and that first year, whether you label it as imposter syndrome or just being overwhelmed by the competitiveness or the demands of that job, I found myself just being timid, maybe a little scared, even walking into the office, wondering what ball was going to drop that I would have to pick up and, run with. And I attended a Final Four my first year, and that was the first Final Four I ever got to attend at age 36. And, there was a presentation being given by John Gordon, who's a motivational speaker. And he was speaking to all these coaches who were in the seminar, probably a room full of like maybe 100, coaches. Among them in the audience was Ed Cooley, Jay Wright, and both those guys are testifying to the fact that they had gone through the exercise of the word, having read the book by John and a co-author called One Word. And so they ended up sharing this exercise, and I ended up picking the word courage as my first year. So having lived through, those words, I knew that at least when I brought it to my own high school program, I could live it out and be authentic to it and be consistent to it. I didn't have to fake it. It's something that I had worked through in my life, the previous years. So I found myself just kind of leading with that first. And it just, again, you prioritize whatever you're going to build in your culture, right? But having that kind of pillar or anchor always directed us when we're having a conversation about player development or commitment or off-season training, that, hey, are you going to be present in the off-season, right? Are you going to show up to our summer camps and volunteer? Are you going to have a presence in the lives of the players that you're trying to be a role model for in the community? Like we come down to the last second shot, like, are we going to be that team that, out of five guys on the floor, like three of them, any one of the three could take a shot on a given day? And do you have the courage to live with the miss, if it doesn't go your way? So I think just having those three pillars really allowed us to have direction, have focus, and some sense of purpose.
Okay. I listened to, I believe it was the Slapping Glass podcast, and you were talking about the importance of kind of building those relationships, kind of daily check-ins with your players, with some chocolate milk or with some Gatorade, down the line. Talk about that and kind of some other things that you did to kind of build that rapport. Because they can't, forget what the phrase is, basically like they can't perform at the highest level if they don't know that you care about them. And that definitely comes with learning about them and what drives them, and kind of being telling them about yourself as well. So kind of talk about what you learned over the years about building rapport and trust with the players that you're entrusted with.
Yeah, that I think today that's probably the toughest thing. I think even in the course of the 8 years that I was at LO, I've seen, how would I put it? Like, I've seen evolution of the kids in terms of how much they need that. I think there's been more conversation centered around mental health and the amount of stress that our kids are under. And then we're coming out of COVID where, their worlds are really turned upside down. And so I think more than anything, I think I'm in this time off that I have this year, like I'm gonna try to do a better job of is really just listening more and giving space for that awkward silence, you know. So even right now, like if I were to just pause for a minute, like what's Aaron thinking about? like, or, you're asking a question like that. And I could just, again, in the setting of a podcast, I can ramble on for hours, but, if I can just turn it around and just ask you a probing question, right? I think that's the biggest thing, right? Like moving forward for me is like, how do you, as a leader, do a better job of meeting the players where they're at?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's increasing the importance every year. Talk about, what you learned as a head coach, just prioritizing your own mental health and kind of getting, I think you were involved in some speaking engagements and stuff like that, with different organizations in high school basketball, providing that type of support to, coaches across the country. Talk about prioritizing that and how you've implemented some of that stuff into your coaching repertoire, I guess.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just high school coaching. I think high school basketball in general in 2023 is in an interesting place, right? Um, I think we even talked about this prior to getting on the camera. Like, even for those of us who are at um, at a competitive school with, student athletes who have aspirations of playing at the next level, college coaches aren't looking at high school players right now, right? It comes from the transfer portal on down. And so, on one hand, I think that's a real opportunity for coaches to recognize that we're in the foundation setting stage of these players, that perhaps they don't need to peak as players until they're juniors and seniors, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're not, a lot of them, if they are good players, they're not going to, unless they're, superstar level, next level players, USA basketball level players, they're not going to contribute right away as freshmen.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you give them that foundation? Right? It's pouring into the players and having the know-how, the knowledge. I think it's like you said, the mental health piece. Like, is your cup full so that you can give, whether that's joy or whether that's focus, to onto your players, model it for them, and then give more to them. But really, what helped me over the 8 years was recognizing that I was part of something bigger than myself. So it's
Mm-hmm.
the same thing I was trying to, push with my players. Was I doing that for the our state association in general, for example? That am I going to run a program that's taking shortcuts with transfers right away? And I think in the DMB, like where you and I coach for years, like there's so many private schools that are recruiting. There's so many options that the elite players have, that it was really it can be a dog eat dog world kind of sense, right? In a sense. And then fast forward like 10 years later from my time there, now like some of the best players are being pulled to these prep schools,
Mm-hmm.
down in Florida, or, the Midwest, the East Coast, in New England, and etc. So I think, as the environment's changing, what can coaches do? I think it's more than ever, like, it's imperative that high school coaches get together and be a part of community, that so that we can talk about the things that are issues for us, so that that they recognize that they're not going through these issues on their own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that, what is it that if you join with a group of coaches, that that you're vulnerable enough to share about what your hardest struggles are as a head coach, and then seeing what kind of solution that can come out of that group think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Talk about, we talked a little bit about building relationships and kind of the importance of that transferring to the court. Talk about what you've learned about seeding control, of making play calls or doing a certain type of offense or defense when it comes to leaders on your team or scores. Kind of what you learned about when you need to be like, no, we need to run this offense versus letting them kind of freestyle. Because a lot of players, they talk about, coach lets me play my game, but kind of more, what does that look like? And
Yeah.
how does a player earn that level of trust when it comes to a coach?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking to a coach who last year, we've gone through this ascent of, winning our league, titles and such, and we went through a really challenging, year last year, where our record was 9-15, and a lot of what I think my philosophy continued to go on this path of letting the players make that decision, more on the floor. But, I think our struggle last year was indicative of how we hadn't done the work together as a unit in the off season,
Mhm.
and that's not to make an excuse, but I think that's where, I think the challenge of a high school coach today is where so many kids are being pulled. And this is again, like I think you see this coaches doing a better job of dealing with this in the East Coast because it happens a lot more where the high level players are doing different showcases one weekend and they're at USA basketball another weekend. So the chance to build that off court chemistry in the off season is, definitely challenging in those, hotbed of basketball, whether that's in the DMV, Chicago, New York, and such. The opportunity in a smaller state like Oregon is that, we don't have that many, things going on, right? So the off season is critical. I mean, it was one of the biggest driving factors for us separating from the pack when we were winning is that our guys did a lot of work in the offseason on their own. So that's small sided games, 2-on-2, 3-on-3, 4-on-4 max, and really limiting that 5-on-5 play so that they're getting as much of the chemistry building as possible, so that when it is a late clock situation, when it's end of quarter situation, that they, and I can call out a set, but there's already a counter that I can't make that decision for them on the floor. It's really up to the player to make that. So I think that's also been driven home to me a lot, as I reflect on the past year and past year's struggle is one chapter, but also as a whole, when I look back on some of the best teams that I had, it's really the off-season work that translated into that level of trust and during the season.
Mm. Okay. And then the last kind of question with LO, and then we'll move on to some quick hitters, and then we'll get you out of here. See it, say it was a quote that I heard a couple times in your interview with Slap and Glass. How have you evolved as a coach in
Mm-hmm.
finding the balance between stopping practice too often and kind of disrupting the flow of things,
Mm-hmm.
especially with this ADD generation of athlete, versus correcting a habit quickly in the moment, to
Yeah.
ensure that you're getting your point across and that the message is sent to the whole team and not just that player.
Yeah. See it, say it. I'm sure, like, if you probably heard it from some coach before, or, my first time hearing it was from a legendary coach here. I had a chance to have coffee with, and Brad Smith, who was a longtime girls coach, head coach here in our state at Oregon City. You think about just some random suburb in Oregon. They were, this girls program was ranked number one nationally for stretches, in the 80s and early 90s. So, I had a chance to have coffee with this coach, Coach Smith, and he said it. And what he meant at the time is, it was more in reference to the players. So getting your players to talk, and so oftentimes players don't know what to say. So he said it like, if you see a back screen, say it, screen. If you see a shot going up, say shot, right? So it's more that phrase was more born out of like getting the players to talk.
Mm.
And so if you flip it as a coach, I think say it, you really got to pick your spot. And when you say it, I think it's got to be, as we've heard in many coaching clinics, you got to speak in sound bites. So it's very different than, again, this podcast where I'm rambling, but you see a player, let's say a teaching point is they're doing a DHO, dribble handoff, and they're not really attacking the defender of the person you're handing off to.
Mhm.
You see it now. What is your teaching point at that point to deliver? Is it to you saw a play where a player wasn't taking full advantage of that opportunity to create an advantage for the rest of the guys on the floor? Do you go into that lecture mode and say, hey, like if you do that, then you just wasted, 3 seconds off the shot clock
Mm.
and we haven't created an advantage, right? I think those deeper conversations, they need to come in the film session,
Mm.
but you need to, as a coach, develop a way of delivering that point, right? Um, you could say, hey, inside the 3-point line, right? So that it really shows that you're not just dribbling around in false motion on outside of the 3-point line, right? Is it a keyword like attack, like be assertive, right? So that if you're inside the 3-point line, you can actually keep it. Or it might be in a form of a question like that. You might stop and say, hey, how you played that, can you keep it and take it for yourself? right? So I think it's just, and again, that variety of response that and the split second decision the coach has to make at that moment. I think it comes down to understanding what kind of constructive criticism that player can take, and how many times have you had to stress that teaching point, right? Well, I mean, we're all human, if you have to stress that teaching point for an eighth or ninth time, that's on the player,
Yeah.
and maybe it's not even see it, say it. It's like, sit him,
Yeah.
have him watch,
Yeah.
and so there's that level of accountability and balance that you gotta approach it with. You gotta have enough of a relationship built in with the players, so that if they're having to sit out for a second and they're upset with you, that you're able to bring him back into the fold, and that next time he steps on the floor, now there's a little bit of sense of urgency, like, well, yeah, coach, let me show you. And I think some of that, like, competitive conflict is okay. I think in light of how much we're talking about the mental health of the players, like, you don't need to make it personal, but look, how can I, to you, Aaron, like, tap into your competitive juices?
Mhm.
If you haven't kept up your part and you're making the same mistake 6, 7, 8 times, like, what's it going to take at that point? Is it one more soundbite, or is it something more? Something more. So I think it's all of that is that's where the magic of coaching is, and that's why we're all trying to get better at it and figure it out as we go.
Got you. Last question, then we'll get to some quick hitters here. What
Okay.
sets the DMV apart from, the different kind of hotbeds, across the country?
Yeah, I mean, that I don't know if I'm the person to answer that, because you'd have to understand that I only have a 3-year window of it, right? And a particular time. Whenever I get a question like that, I also point back to, when people, I don't want to fall into the trap of just having what I experienced from my lens in a particular window of time, right? So
Mhm.
people ask me, "Hey, what's Africa like?" I mean, what I can't answer that for you. Like, I can tell you what Mozambique in 2006 to 2009 was like.
Yeah.
I haven't been back since 2009. I can't answer that for you. I
Mhm.
can't answer what's a DMV like. I have a certain window of the DeMatha Catholic experience, which is '09 to, let's see, '09 to 12, right? And my first 2 years, we won the WCAC championship. My third year, James Robinson misses a shot against PBI, where we had a chance to be a four-peat. So, I've been spoiled in that sense, even from my time at DeMatha. So I can't tell you, like, after I left the next year, we didn't get that far. And it was a very challenging year for Coach Jones and the staff.
Mhm.
And so, the little bit that I do remember is just how much competition there was, from that window of time. And you're talking about players, this is Chris Jenkins and Nate Britt at Gonzaga. This is Holloway just kind of starting to get his, footing with PBI. Coach Ferrello had just taken over. His first year, I believe was '09, was my first year at staff. So PBI hadn't really gotten going yet,
Mhm.
and so what I remember the most is, even as a varsity assistant coach, going to eighth grade games, just the level of competition, and how people are, seeking out the best fit for themselves. I think I would imagine it's still the same, with an additional equation of these prep schools popping up, and players going to overtime elite and other places for elite players. But
Mhm.
really, that window of time, it wasn't that much. So every program was so competitive. Um, and so again, what's the separator? It's those things that we talked about with Victor and Jerry and everybody else, right? It's the chip on your shoulder, it's the belief, and it's the work ethic that matches all that.
100%. All right. So for these quick hitters, just the first thing that kind of comes to mind. So what's a game show that you think you could win?
Phew. Um, None. I'm not a game show person. Uh, yeah. Uh, like, you could, I don't know if I have enough random trivia like Jeopardy, or if I have, the spelling acumen of a Wheel of Fortune. I don't pay attention to prices of the grocery store for prices right. If there's just a basketball centric TV show, then I'd be all right. But that's one of my faults. I don't watch other sports. I don't do fantasy football. I don't golf. I'm learning now, but I don't do it on a regular basis. It's really hoops or nothing. So if there's a hoop centric TV show, let me know. Otherwise, I'll be pretty useless.
Invite three basketball minds to a dinner to chop it up with. They could be dead or alive.
John Wooden, Eric Spoelstra, who I've gotten to know recently. He's a Portland grad, a Jesuit high school local coach. He and I actually got to connect a little bit, since I did the Slap and Glass interview.
Mhm.
And the third would be, Morgan Wooten. I got to see Coach Wooten, walk around the tracks a little bit, and I'd see him, from time to time. But by the time I got there, really, he wasn't around as much.
Mhm.
So I would love to have sat down on an old Morgan Wooten, John Wooden conversation with a current coaching hero of mine, who's Eric Spoelstra. That would
Okay.
be a fun evening.
What coach have you stolen the most from?
Um, it's Coach Jones. Honestly, he's my North Star in terms of a standard. Um, Coach Showalter, the junior national team coach, he was so gracious with me during my early years as support staff, giving me a chance to get on the court and help, which just doesn't happen today. Those two guys have probably had the biggest impact on my coaching career. And then if I'm stealing, um, honestly, I steal a lot from my assistant coaches. Like I have Jason Luno, who is a current video coordinator. He was my assistant coach for a long time. Rob Smaller, who's my player development guy and associate head coach the last few years. Um, I think that's I'm fortunate to have access to some of the best coaches through our junior national team pool or coaches overseas. But something that I really take pride in and I'm grateful for is that I have assistant coaches who are lifelong learners and they're more hip to it. If I'm talking about stealing, it could be something as easy as rolling your white socks over your sweatpants. Look, I'm 47. I'm not trying to be like fake it, but like I did that for a stretch in practice just to, not mock them, but have a little friendly banter going like, am I hip like you guys, but I think it's something to be said as I was getting older. I went through, being 39 years old when I took over the program to 47. And with each passing year, you know, I'm getting older.
Yeah.
I'm picking up some gray hairs and I'm not as cool as I used to be. So I think just having, younger coaches who are more in tune with the players, I've stolen a lot just to stay relative.
MJ or LeBron?
MJ.
What book is a must read for every basketball coach?
Oof, that's a good one. And if I just have to pick, it's hard to just pick one. Um, yeah, it's almost like you're gonna have to come back to me on that one. But yeah, you stumped me just because if I'm just picking one, that's hard. But
Mhm.
the book that the coaching book that Coach Wooden wrote, version 2, where Coach Jones was, had a big part of it. I remember when I first got to the staff, I read everything because I just again I didn't know. So I highlighted everything and it turns out, Coach Jones had done a good job of taking the old with the new, right? And so I think that book gave me kind of a foundation without having to be that annoying assistant coach who's always asking questions. I had a little bit of base knowledge to go off of it. Um, and then after that, I would say there's a lot of books that I read that's outside. So for example, Range is a book that I've read recently that I refer back to, a lot. Um, I think in this day and age where there's a lot of specialists, especially if you're trying to be a head coach, you have
Mhm.
to be a jack of all trades. And just like I touched in the beginning of the interview, where I'm pretty confident in that I have a range to coach from kindergartners all the way to professional players. I think in today's world, you have to be your own, social media promoter for your program, or you have to be, somebody who's really good at fundraising. are you good at operations? Are you good at booking your own travel for your team? Or do you know how to delegate? Do you know what good travel looks like? Right.
Mm.
And I think just given the nature of where the world is today, and how challenging being a high school coach is, if you have that range, you're going to set yourself up to be more successful than your competition.
Would you rather take a charge from Shaq or try to guard KD with the game on the line?
Neither. That's crazy. Why would I do that? I mean,
Got to pick one.
KD, yeah, I'm 5'8". Just for all the people out there have that visual, be like Muggsy Bogues trying to guard him. If I get to pick him up full court and harass him a little bit, I mean, so it all really depends on the time and score, right? Am I down? Am I up? Do I get to pick him up full court? Am I on an ISO? Am I coming off the help side?
It
You
sounds
know,
like you're
I'll
considering that
just
one over the Shaq charge.
scope. Yeah. I honestly, the charge part is also interesting. You don't, if you're good at selling it, you don't have to take that direct hit, right? If he's barreling down on a fast break and he's catching an alley oop to dunk over you, or if he's like, rim line just with the ball coming down at you and you're at the charge circle, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. But on the split ice, quick ISO where he dips his shoulder into you one time and you can, fake the hit. Again, so I think hopefully for the listeners, it's more like depends. And then, I'm gonna answer it the way I want to answer it, right?
I got you. What's the best dynasty you've seen in basketball?
USA basketball, junior national team.
Hmm.
They've yet to lose international competition.
It's been a hell of a run. That's
Shout out to Coach Jones, who took over for Coach Showalter, and shout out to the current head coach, Sharman White.
yes, sir. Who's an underrated Twitter follow that you kind of find a lot of valuable stuff from?
Underrated's hard just because like there's so many, but yeah, it's a good question. I've really been leaning on Slapping Glass a lot these days. I know you refer to them. They don't have a big Twitter following, so I guess I'll shout them out. I think they have a lot of good content, and what I appreciate about those guys is they ask really good follow-up questions that
Mm-hmm.
show that they've done their homework and preparation for
Mm-hmm.
their subjects.
Okay.
The coaches that they interview.
It's a great podcast or YouTube series that you're into right now.
Um, now that I'm in this kind of transition and trying to be a business person, there's a great one called How I Built This with Guy Raz. R-A-Z is the last name. Just interviewing a bunch of, guys, men and women who started their own business. So I probably have that on my rotation on a weekly basis.
Okay. What coaches do you study the most?
Whew. More recently, I've been kind of on my international game fix. So, I'm wearing my Hoop Summit hoodie right now. One of the things I decided to do this past year was, um, I had an opportunity to, after having served with USA Basketball for 10 years, and maybe, my days back with USAB will come again, but I received a call to join the world team coaching staff, for the Hoop Summit game. So I had a chance to, as Roy Rana, who ran them for 10 years, moved on, Caleb Canales, currently an associate head coach with the Texas Legends, longtime NBA assistant coach, got a chance to take over as a head coach, and I had a chance to be his assistant this past April. So more so than coaches, I just find myself watching the international game a lot more and trying to see what it looks like, whether you're coaching 16, 17-year-olds or even for the FIBA game currently that's going on with the World Championships. What does it look like to operate with a 24-second shot clock? I'm thinking about that a lot because I'll be hopefully involved with the game again this coming April.
What's the hardest shot in basketball to you? Like, to me, it's when you're in transition and that point guard passes you the ball at the last second and you're like in like the dunker spot, like just outside the paint, and defender kind of has time to contest your shot and it's a weird angle. That's just mine. But what's the hardest shot in basketball to you?
Um, let's see. That's a good question. Can you hear me okay, by the way,
Yep.
on this?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, give me 1 second here. Not the technical difficulty part, but my headphone was running that. Transitioning over to the.
It's all good.
Can you hear me? So you were saying
Hardest
the
shot in
hardest shot in
basketball.
basketball.
Yep.
Okay, and for you, it was.
For me, it was when you're in transition and the point guard passes you the ball at the last second, and you're in like the short corner, like outside the block area, and you have to get that shot off most of the time with the defender
Wow.
rotating over, and it's kind of a bad angle. That's mine.
Yeah. I mean, any shot that's late clock, right?
Mm.
With pressure on. Um, the hardest shot for it, again, this is the depends, right? What player is it, right?
Yeah,
Is it a player that's
you.
never used to taking that game-winning shot? Is it, a player that is being double teamed constantly? So I think it's all, if anything, it's context,
Mm.
so hardest shot that I've noticed, at least for my players, is really just the mid range in
Mm.
general. I feel like more and more with a lot of our players, I don't know if you see it on the East Coast, but so many of them, what's amazing is the shot making ability of these young players now in
Yeah.
transition,
Hmm.
taking the difficult shots. And what I find is that I've really rarely had a player who has that great mid range touch,
Yep.
and whether that's off of one bounce or two bounce. I just don't see players working on that enough to dominate that simple part of the game that we've seen Kobe or anybody else. Like, players don't put enough time in the gym to get better at that versus, there's only so much time in the day. And what I find players work on the most is the difficult shots, not the simple ones.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Two more questions and we'll get you out of here. Half court shot was with some money, or as like Coach Jones likes to do, with some nice shoes in the line. You were MJ, like MJ, like Mike Jones.
This will be man, episode 94. No, this is constantly debated. We have just enough data with our film to dispute who's won. Um, but if you ask him, he's gonna say he's won more, and if you ask me, I'm gonna say I won more. But the next time I see him, hopefully it's visiting the Terrapins. I'll cede the home court advantage, and even the ball, basketball will have to shoot with the Under Armour ball, not a Nike ball or a Wilson ball. But um, I like my chances as the underrated underdog on the road.
Not gonna lie, my favorite video for me, the one of you on social media with the half court shot, was, I think it was like right after the pandemic. You were coming across the court in the ball cage at LO.
Mm-hmm.
You saying that
Yes.
was top tier. All right, so the
Yeah.
last question, Coach Joe, as you've had an opportunity to kind of reflect on your career, that this season here off, what do you want your legacy to be?
Yeah. Um, I, I think I shared with you before I got onto the interview. I had a chance to go watch Coach Jones get his name dedicated onto the Morgan Wooden Court, and one of the things it really dawned on me was what it looked like to be a part of something bigger than yourself. So I think that's a constant theme for me. I think that's why I was able to transition so easily as a non-DeMatha grad into that coaching staff. And it's something that I try to do every day in my own program. You know, um, I think success doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think it's very easy for in this day and age to think that if you put in enough hard work on your own, that you're going to get to where you need to. And there's been so many talented players that I've seen that was unable to do that, through my 10 years being in this space like USA basketball. Um, and I recognize more than ever that if I can build something that allows people to have their part in contributing to its success and feeling like they did that, they're always going to want to come back because it gave them a sense of ownership and a sense of pride when they look back on it. So my biggest legacy, wherever I've been, would be to um, to build something where people were a part of it. that
Mhm.
this isn't all about me, but really I'm willing to be front and center. And even, as a Korean American in the basketball space, that's not normally seen. you know, Culturally, I'm not comfortable with it, but I've had to consistently come out of my comfort zone to do that. And that also means that I take the faults when things don't go well. And I'm willing to do that as well if I can be a shield for the people that I'm working with and working on behalf of. But
Mhm.
out of that place of safety, the people that I'm responsible for, I hope that more than anything that they've had a sense of ownership and what they've been able to contribute into something that we all built together.
Last question. I'm sorry. What it just popped into my head. So if you were to kind of tell, I think you said 31-year-old Marshall Cho at the beginning of this, if you could give yourself kind of one piece of advice, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. Um, Looking back now, 31, I had just gotten married. I had a chance to work some basketball without borders camps, and it's interesting. It's been 2 decades, and I've ran my own race, and I'm content at 47 years old where I've gotten to. And I don't ever want to get into the comparison game. For example, Tiger Woods and I are the same age. Like, does that
Mhm.
make sense for me to have any, joy if I'm comparing myself to somebody, like that, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, I look back and a lot of the guys that I started out in the journey with, their NBA head coaches or NBA head GMs, and they've gotten to a certain point, I think, career-wise, where they're able to, provide for their family and whatnot. I and I don't mean this in a way where I envy where they are and I'm putting down where I am myself today, but I do recognize for myself that I didn't think I belonged in that space at 31 years old. And it's taken me 2 decades to realize that no, I put the work in, I do belong.
Mhm.
And I think um, that sense of not feeling like I belonged on that stage kept me from maximizing all the opportunities I had in front of me. If anything, I had a self-imposed cap on what I can become. And I think that
Mhm.
at my age now, 20 years into it, I'm comfortable in my skin, comfortable in my journey, in my craft to say, the next 20 years, I can do whatever I set my mind on. And I didn't think I had that mindset 20 years ago.
Mhm.
So I'm a
100%.
slow learner, still getting there, but I think I only say that I need to have that for myself because if I don't have it for myself as a coach, and I think there's a natural cap that I'm going to put on my own players, and I don't want to be that coach. I want the players that I work for to dream big and go after it, but also recognizing the incredible amount of work comes with kind of chasing the dream.
Yes, sir. 100%. Well, I appreciate the time today, coach. And, we'll keep in touch. Looking forward to seeing what venture you end up doing next.
Thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
Yes, sir.